Dear students, today I'm going to discuss a very interesting topic from history of English literature, neoclassical literature. An age actually which is remarkable for the great mock epic poem like The Rape of the Lock, great periodicals like The Spectator and The Tatler, great novels like Pamela or Virtue Rewarded and Tom Jones, great critical pieces like An Essay on Dramatic Poesy and Preface to Shakespeare. Now this 18th century literature, which is called an excellent and indispensable 18th century Matthew Arnold, is an important topic going to be discussed by me today in this video lecture. This will be covering some part of Restoration Age, the age of Pope, and the age of Johnson. And I hope this will be very useful for you for your examination and also for your future competitive examinations if you're going to appear, say, in UGC NET examination or research eligibility test and other examinations. So let us now start it. So neoclassical age. Now this is the time period which is very significant, which you will keep in mind. This is 1660 to 1798. Now the dates are very important, not only for your examination this time, but also for your future examinations, some competitive examinations. So when you say neoclassical age, you must keep this in your mind, 1660 to 1798. Now, what is basically neoclassical age? Now this line, look at this line. Neoclassical age is basically defined as the imitation of classicism. Now, what is basically an imitation? What is classicism? That I'll tell you in the upcoming slides. But neoclassical age is basically defined as the imitation of classicism. When you just look at the literal meaning of neoclassicism, so literally neo means new. And classical, the word classical refers to the style and works of the ancient writers of Greece and Rome. Now this is the point which is very significant, which you'll keep in mind, that neo means new and classical means style and works of the ancient writers of Greece and Rome. If you just take it all together, neoclassicism, it means a kind of rebirth or revival of classical learning, but this you will not interpret as you do in the case of Renaissance. Because when you say neoclassicism, it means number one, imitation of classicism. And when you just interpret the entire word neoclassicism, it means neo means new and classical refers to the style and works of the ancient writers. Now, this period is called neoclassical, as I have just told you in the previous slide, because the writers looked back to the ideals and art forms of the classical times. So here the classical time is very important. What are the basic ideals of order and rational control which were found in the classical time? This neoclassical age, because I told you that neoclassical age is from 1660 to 1798. This was the date. But if you bifurcate it, you can do it in 4 parts. This you will also keep in mind. This neoclassical age, Restoration age, is from 1660 to 1700. Then we have age of Pope from 1700 to 1745. Then we have age of Johnson, which you can call the age of sensibility also. This is from 1745 to 1798. And then we have age of transition, 1740 to 1798. Now, we call it age of Pope because, Pope dominated the age during that time. And Pope died in the year 1744. And that is why after the death of Alexander Pope, Dr. Samuel Johnson, became a dominant voice of that time, and that is why we call it the age of Johnson, or the age of sensibility. That it starts from the year 1745. Now, the age of transition is actually the transitional age, you can say, or we can call it. We have many transitional poets also. You must have studied Thomas Gray, who is a transitional poet. And transitional poets, you will learn later, are the poets in whose poetry we have the mixture of neoclassicism and romanticism. So we have the transition. So this neoclassical age, four parts: Restoration age, 1660 to 1700, and then we have age of Pope, then we have age of Johnson, then we have age of transition. These dates are very important. Now, you see, this age is also called Augustan age. The first thing which you will keep in mind, it was Oliver Goldsmith who first designated the early 18th century as the Augustan age. This was the question actually which I found in most of the competitive examinations, who called 18th century as Augustan age. It was Oliver Goldsmith. Now, Augustan age stands for any period of polished manners, high culture, and great literary attainments. And because it is compared with the Roman Empire, Augustus Caesar, during which Virgil, Ovid, Horace, and other great poets lived and wrote. So when you say Augustan age, it means an age which is important for its polished manners, high culture, and great literary attainments, as was found in the age of Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar. Now, during the time of Augustus Caesar, the writers like Virgil, Ovid, and Horace, they wrote. So this age is called Augustan age because many great writers wrote during this period. The meaning of Augustan age is, just as reign of Augustus is known as the classic and golden age of Rome, in the same way, age of Queen Anne, 18th century, is called Augustan age in English literature because it was also as productive, as fruitful as the age of Augustus Caesar. During the reign of Queen Anne, we have abundant production of prose, poetry, and drama. This age is also called the age of reason and good sense. Now, this 18th century is also called the age of reason and good sense because it was an age of understanding and enlightenment, and it was based on the good sense of the ideal of French critic Boileau. The 18th century writers did not believe in imagination and overflowing enthusiasm. And these qualities are found in the Romantic age. And these 18th century writers did not, believe in boundless imagination, overflowing enthusiasm. They laid stress on reason and good sense. These writers, they hated mystery and religious broodings. Their outlook was thoroughly rational, and because of which we call this age the age of reason and good sense. Now, during 18th century, this age is also known for the rise of the novel. All of you know that the novel emerged in 18th century. And, this 1740 is the date which is very significant in the history of novel because Pamela or Virtue Rewarded was published. Now, we have, as I told you, 1740 as the date which is very significant because Pamela or Virtue Rewarded was published. Virtue Rewarded was published. This is the first novel by Samuel Richardson. Samuel Richardson. So 18th century is famous for the rise of the novel. Uh, like you know why did the novel emerge during this time? Because of the expansion of education, rise of the new class of readers and publishers, new patrons of literature, circulating libraries, all contribute to the popularity of the novel. And we have four important uh, novelists of this period. We have Fielding, Richardson, Smollett, and Sterne. And these four altogether are called four wheels of English novel. So this 18th century is also called as is important for the rise of the novel. Uh, now, this 18th century is also called, as I showed you in the first slide, that this was the classical age in the sense that these writers tried to follow the principles and rules laid down by the ancients. But the point is that this was basically the imitation, and imitation can never be original. Imitation is always, imitation can never be original, and that is why this kind of classicism which they showed was a kind of pseudo classes. Pseudo means false. So this 18th century was also called the pseudo classical age. Pseudo means false. The 18th century is called the age of pseudo-classicism in the sense that the writers of this age imitated only the rules of the great ancient classics, but not the essential spirit of them. So the form was like the classical writers, but the spirit was not like that. And that is why they were called the pseudo-classical writers, the false writers, or the fake, you can say. Now, coming to another important quality of 18th century writers, that we have this Matthew Arnold called 18th century as excellent and indispensable 18th century. This was also the phrase which is used for 18th century literature, that it was excellent and indispensable 18th century. Why was it excellent, indispensable? Number one, because of the development of English prose, the periodical essay, and the novel. It was the cradle and playground of the novel. 18th century was also famous for writing letters. The art of poetry was developed. The famous periodicals like Tatler, Spectator, Rambler, Examiner, they came into existence during, 18th century. And we have the end of 18th century saw the rise of English Romanticism, which culminated in the lyrical ballads of Wordsworth and Coleridge. This was excellent because it produced a galaxy of writers like Addison, Swift, Richardson, Fielding, Goldsmith, Dr. Johnson, Burke, Gibbon, and Pope. From the political point of view also, it was very excellent because, it saw the abundant rise of wealth and industry. It was also an age of peace and prosperity. So Matthew Arnold was correct when he called this age as indispensable, 18th century. Now, during 18th century, we have some popular types of literature, like parody was written, essays were written, satire was written, letters, fables, melodrama, rhyming couplets, which we call, heroic couplet. The term heroic couplet was very popular in 18th century, and most of the writing was written in heroic couplet. Heroic couplet was the popular medium of expression neoclassicism. As you know, if you read, that is why I suggested you to, go through my video on meter and feet in poetry. That is the video which is there that discusses the prosody, and you will learn all these important points. So heroic couplet is basically the arrangement of iambic pentameter in a rhyming pair of lines. You know that when we say iambic means a pair of two syllables where the first one is unstressed and second is stressed. This is iambic. And when we say pentameter, pentameter means 5 feet and 5 feet means 10 syllables. You will learn all these technical terms in this video, meter and feet, on this channel. Now, this example I have written one from The Rape of the Lock, which is a famous poem by Alexander Pope. And if you want to see the characteristics of neoclassical age, 18th century, then you just go through the poem The Rape of the Lock, which is an example of mock epic. It's a mock epic poem. And this is the example. Hear thou great Anna whom three realms obey, dost sometimes counsel take and sometimes tea. It is also an example of a technical device which we call bathos, which is a kind of understatement. Obey and so you will, when you read this line, then I think you will be able to understand heroic couplet. Periodical essays were also written during this period, as I have already told you in my previous slide. And in periodical essays, I mentioned the name of Edison, Steele, and also some important, periodicals like the Tatler, the Spectator. These are the two names, Richard Steele and Joseph Edison. And these periodical essays later led to the development of the novels. A novel which I told you came into its full form in the year 1740. Comedy of Manners, which was written during Restoration age, is also part of neoclassical age. We can comedy of manners we can call Restoration comedy. This comedy of manners were designed to satirize the vices and follies of the elite class. They attacked on the vices and follies of the aristocratic society, and these are the playwrights William Congreve, George Etheridge, William Wycherley. These are some popular writers who wrote comedy of manners. And if you want to see the characteristics of comedy of manners, read The Way of the World by William Congreve. This is the best example of comedy of manners. What are some important characteristics of a neoclassical age? This is the first and the most important characteristic, that is, they focused on urban life. Why am I telling you this point? Because when you study Romantic age basically focused on the rural life, and they focused on urban life. If you take one example, The Rape of the Lock is an example. Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope is actually focused on the city life and on character Belinda, who belongs to the aristocratic society. The poetry of 18th century is basically the poetry of the town, the coffee house, and the artificial society. And you will find this in Alexander Pope's poem, The Rape of the Lock. This is the first characteristic of neoclassical age. Now, this is the second characteristics, to follow nature. Nature is a very important characteristic of Romantic age. Here also you'll find out nature. To follow nature is an important characteristic, but it is used in a different sense. Pope exhorted his contemporaries to follow nature. However, the nature of the Augustan period was not the nature of Wordsworth. The Augustans were drawn towards human nature rather than a nature we have in. This is something which is very important. When they said to follow nature, this is human nature, not the nature which we find in forest, or as the Wordsworth has described in his poems. Their sole aim was to copy man and the manners of society. And famous line of Alexander IV, the proper study of mankind is man. So they focused on nature, but that was human nature, not the nature as depicted by the Romantic poets. Now, neoclassical literature considered man as a limited being having limited power. So, a very important characteristic, and that is why large number literary work and satire attack man for his false pride and attack him to remain content with the limited power of night. And just look at the line of Alexander Pope: "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man." Coming to next characteristic, the rules of the ancient classical writers. They wanted to follow, they wanted to conform to the rules and regulations laid down by the classical writers. Writers like Pope, Swift, Dryden, they believe that the excellence and perfection in the literary art can be attained by imitating the Roman writers of antiquity. Their basic purpose was to replicate the model of excellence. They wanted to become as excellent as the classical writers. So, and they did not want to deviate from rules and regulations laid down by those classical writers. So theirs was the model of excellence. Now, this was an important characteristic of neoclassical writers, to adhere to the rules of ancient classical writers. Coming to the poetic diction, what kind of language did they use? This is something which is very important, because most of the time you encounter with this word poetic diction. Now, poetic diction simply means, diction means language. And but when we use the term poetic diction in the context of 18th century, then poetic diction means this highly ornamental and beautified language. When we say a poetic diction, it means highly ornamental and beautified language. Poetic diction was highly figurative. Language was not meant for laymen. It was meant for elite class. So in 18th century, special kind of language was used, which we call poetic diction. And that was highly ornamental language, highly ornamental and beautified language, figurative language, metaphorical language. And this language was not meant for layman. It was meant for elite class, high class. Why am I emphasizing on this point? Because later on, when I discuss Romantic Age with you, then I'll tell you that Romantic poetry focuses on the common man, not an elite class. The purpose of Romantic poets is to write for the common people, and that is why Wordsworth says, "Humble and rustic life is chosen." Rustic life is chosen. This Wordsworth says in his preface to the lyrical ballads. Preface to the lyrical ballads. Now, the language which I have just talked about of 18th century was gaudy and inane. The word gaudy and inane, Wordsworth uses it in his preface, and that is why I have taken this phrase, gaudy and inane. Gaudy means showy or artificial. So the language of 18th century was gaudy and inane, and it was actually far away from the ordinary language. So because they used this gaudy and inane language, and that is why the literature became artificial, stilted, rational and intellectual, losing all inspiration, enthusiasm and romantic fervor. And this inspiration, enthusiasm, romantic fervor was found in the Elizabethan age, and later on you will find out in romantic poetry. It was not found in neoclassical age. Now, they were very fond of using allusions, examples, from the great writers of antiquity. The writers like, Alexander Pope and Dryden, they were drawing the examples from Homer, Virgil and Ovid. Then coming to next point, they used morality and didacticism in their poetry. Now, later on in the next slide, I'll tell you that they were very fond of writing satires. And 18th century literature is famous for social satire. And if satire is there, the purpose is to correct the society, to reform the society. Now, and when you try to reform the society, your purpose always becomes moral. Your purpose always becomes didactic because you teach something. So morality is there in the poetry. Didacticism is there because they are teaching, preaching something, because they are trying to correct the vices of the society. As I've just told you that they wrote satire, and by that they tried to ridicule the follies and preached the society. Now, this realism is another important quality of 18th century. And as I have just told you that 18th century literature is famous for social satire and realism. They tried to depict the society. And if you want to see the example, you see Alexander Pope's Rape of the Lock or Dryden's Aurangzeb. These are the best example of social satire and realism. The character of Belinda, if you just study in The Rape of the Lock, you will find out how Alexander Pope is trying to mock at the character of Belinda and laugh at the follies and foibles. But the purpose is always corrective. And that is why in the previous slide, I told you that this didacticism is an important characteristic which we find in the poetry. Now, when you come to some other characteristics, like this 18th century is marked by restraint, reason, and order. Then next, wit and common sense. Then absence of the passion for lyricism. Then overmastering desire for the polish, sharpness, and correctness in style. Then unflinching devotion to the heroic couplet, as I told you in the previous slide. So these are some other characteristics which you find in the neoclassical literature. There are some prominent literary figures, and need not to be explained too much, but at least passing reference should be given to the writers, that we have representative. When you talk about poetry, we have the representative poets like Dryden, Goldsmith, Pope, Milton. And each poet surfaced one among the three segments of the neoclassical poetry, one from Restoration age, one from Augustan age, and one from the age of transition. And I think you have already studied these poets. You know about John Milton. Then Milton wrote the famous epic Paradise Lost and Samson Agonistage. Dryden wrote The Hind and the Panther. And when you come to Alexander Pope, as I have already discussed with you, Alexander Pope is known for his poem The Rape of the Lock. And apart from that, Winds and Forest, Pastorals, Essays on Criticism, Essay on Man, Dunshed. These are some other important characteristics. Then we come to Matthew Prior. Matthew Prior is known for Elmar, The Progress of the Mind. Not very prominent poet as Dryden and Pope. Graveyard poetry was also, we have some graveyard poets. The graveyard poets, these are the graveyard poets. These are the poems: Night Piece on Death by Thomas Parnell, The Grave by Robert Blair, Night Thoughts by Edward Young, Elegy to the Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray. And what is this graveyard poetry? Graveyard poetry refers to a group of 18th century poets whose works dealt with the themes of death, sorrow, and morality. And the setting of these, poems is always in graveyard. I hope that you have already studied the poem Elegy Written in the Country Churchyard, and there you will find out the theme of death, sorrow, and mortality is there, and the setting is in graveyard. And these poets discusses melancholy and all these tearfulness, nostalgia, and other states of mind. And these are the poets and the poem, famous poems: Night Piece on Death by Thomas Parnell, The Grave by Robert Blair, Night Thoughts by Edward Young, Elegy Written in the Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray. When you come to neoclassical prose, again, this age is called the age of prose and reason by Matthew Arnold, in one of his critical pieces. And Dryden was a poet, but we find in his poetry characteristics of good prose, neatness, lucidity, uniformity, and balance. And this is a very famous statement made by Matthew Arnold. He declared that Dryden and Pope were the classics of prose, not of poetry. This is the line actually which I found many times in different competitive examinations, that who said that Dryden and Pope are the classics of prose, not of poetry. It was said by Matthew Arnold, and Matthew Arnold found that, found prose qualities in the poetry of Dryden and Pope. Now, coming to next writer, Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift is famous for Battle of Books, Tale of Tap, the Whigs for the Tories, Gulliver's Travels. Joseph Addison is famous for, as I told you in the previous slide, that he's famous for his periodical, especially Spectator, and he also contributed some essays in Tatler, which for which Steele is famous. Richard Steele, pseudonym Isaac Bickerstaff, essayist, dramatist, journalist, politician, and he's known for his periodical, that is, the Tatler. Coming to critical, pieces, criticism in neoclassical era. I discussed with you poetry, then I told you something about prose. Now there's some critical pieces. So we have two famous critics, Dr. Samuel Johnson and John Dryden. An essay on dramatic poesy is written by Dryden, and a preface to Shakespeare was written by Dr. Johnson. So these are two famous critical pieces. So criticism was also written during neoclassical age. As I told you in my previous slide, that this age is famous for rise of the novel, and we have some important novelists like Daniel Defoe, who is famous for Robinson Crusoe. Then Four Wheels of English novel, Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, and Sterne. These are the four wheels of English novel. Samuel Richardson, as I told you in the previous slide, wrote Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, published in 1740. Clarissa, A History of Sir Charles Grandison. So, more than that, he is famous for epistolary novels. Epistolary novels are those novels which are where the novel story develops in the form of the letters. So Samuel Richardson wrote epistolary novel, and Pamela is an example of that. Coming to Henry Fielding. Henry Fielding is important for Joseph Andrews, Tom Jones, Amelia, Jonathan Swift. Now, Fielding is important for picaresque novels, especially Tom Jones. I think picaresque novel, all of you know that it has a central character, which is a picaro, that is a rogue, and he wanders from one place to the other in order to depict the society. Then we have Tobias Smollett, who is famous for Humphrey Clinker and Roderick Random. And then we have Lawrence Sterne, who is famous for his Tristram Shandy and the Sentimental Journey. These are two famous novels of Lawrence Sterne. So these are the four wheels. So what are the important points which you are going to remember? First thing, neoclassical, the meaning, that what is the meaning of the term neoclassical age. I told in the previous slide that neo means new and classical means rules, regulations of the classical writers. And then the period, like, 4 parts, as I told you, 4 parts. What are the 4 parts? And then what are the major literary forms which were written during this period? Like, parody was written, satire was written. Then you will come to the main characteristics, main features, that what are the main features of neoclassical age. And then you will come to that what are the major titles which are given to neoclassical age. For example, Augustan age, age of prose and reason, then indispensable 18th century, 15th century. Okay, and then we have like prominent figures of, say, poetry, like Pope Dryden. Then you will come to novels, then we come to prose, then you will come to critical pieces. So these are some points which I think if you cover, then you will be able to understand the neoclassical age. I hope this video will be useful for you. Just keep on watching, at least watch 2 times, then you'll be able to understand the entire concept of neoclassical age.